move a little ahead of schedule to our final speaker for session F in the sequence, and that's Professor Nicholas Postgate at Cambridge University. We had a slight technical issue earlier, which meant that we may not be able to see Nicholas, which is very frustrating, but I hope nonetheless you'll be able to launch his PowerPoint. Repeat what I said yesterday in how much Professor Postgate has been instrumental in making this event a reality. So my thanks very much to him for that. And we look forward to his talk on what was the doubler, which is just emerging.
Am I audible?
You are audible indeed. Thank you very much indeed. The stage is yours.
Well, I would like to apologize very much for being invisible. It was working perfectly well yesterday and earlier this morning, but it's decided to blank me out. So you will just have the slideshow items to see. I'll come to it in a minute, but it's interesting that for the third time in this session, we have the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur on the screen. I wanted to talk about the Dubla, or maybe the A Dubl al Mach, as Woolley refers to it. And briefly, I need to make a short introduction about the exercise of justice. It's a well-known fact that Mesopotamian rulers from the earliest historical times recognized their God-given duty to deliver justice as well as prosperity to their subjects, and prided themselves on so doing. So Urukagina tells us in Jerry Cooper's translation that he solemnly promised Ningirsu that he would never subjugate the waif and the widow to the powerful, and half a millennium later, Hammurabi echoes this sentiment almost exactly. However, we learn little from the texts about how this responsibility was actually carried out over the centuries. The involvement of rulers is only sparsely attested in the documentation. For obvious reasons, the ultimate authority of the ruler was usually delegated to his subordinates or referred to local institutions, which no doubt had a long tradition of delivering justice to their neighborhoods. In the Ur3 texts, we find ensis, or occasionally a priest, sangha, delivering judgments, but the court records, Falkenstein's Gerichtsurkunden, known in large numbers from the Ur3 dynasty, show that in many cases the presiding officials were drawn from the society at large without any mention of the ensi or of the king. For example, Falkenstein lists a scribe, a seafaring merchant, an aide, a sukal, a captain, a nubanda, a soldier, agaus, and a treasurer, gaduba, and an ex-dispicer, a mashu gid. Judges did not always act alone, but as members of a consortium, and these are predominantly secular positions, not temple staff. Legal cases could be referred to the local assemblies, both in town and in the countryside. In Old Babylonian times, they are sometimes mentioned as the sons of a town or a village. Even the villages had assemblies. And at Dilbat, in the reign of Hammurabi's successor Samsu-iluna, a legal case is referred to the sons of the Babtum of Dilbat. The word Babtum refers to a subdivision of a city, which we would call a neighborhood or a ward. Now, though we may be told who was in charge of the court cases, we are not often told where they delivered their judgments. After the judges reached their decision, we frequently read that they sent the participants in the case to a temple to take an oath. That presumably means that the proceedings were initially not in a temple, or at least not in the cellar or in the presence of the divine statue or symbol. On the other hand, in a few instances, we are told that the oaths were to be taken at a dubla, sometimes qualified as a high dubla, a dubla mach. Two examples of this are known from Ur, one in the reign of Ibisin, one under Nur Adad of the following Isin dynasty. This must have been a common practice in Ur 3 times, because here, as you see on the screen, in the lament over Sumer and Ur, the poet wrote, "Verdicts were not given at the Dubla Mach, the place where oaths used to be taken. The throne was not set up at its place of judgment. Justice was not administered." That was presumably at Ur, since it comes from that text. But other cities also had a high dubla, a dubla mach. One on an Ur 3 tablet from Adab records the issue of a fattened sheep to a dubla mach. Another from Drehem mentions a libation at the dubla mach of Nana. So Nana being the city god of Ur, this probably was also at Ur. Now, before going any further, we need to look quickly at this curious word, dubla. In one later bilingual text, the word dubla is given the Akkadian equivalent tuplu, as you see there in the top line. The word tuplu is unfortunately only attested here, so that doesn't give us a direct clue to its meaning. It's probable, for reasons summarized in this diagram, which I won't go through in detail, that tuplum was actually a Semitic, if not necessarily Akkadian, word borrowed into Sumerian rather than a Sumerian word borrowed into Akkadian. The earliest mention of a dubla known to me is the entry in a bilingual Sumerian Akkadian lexical list from Ebla, where you see dubla in Sumerian equals durzu in Semitic, and the Semitic equivalent has plausibly been interpreted by Lambert as being a variant of the later Akkadian durushu, a foundation. And this works, it agrees with a much later lexical text, which gives us du ublu as an equivalent of ishtu, which means a foundation or a plinth. Lambert suggested in an Orientalia article that, and I quote, "Dubla must surely be the stone block in which the door pole turned at its base." However, earlier in the same article, he wrote that, quote, "All the evidence favors foundation platform." And to my mind, this has to be definitely preferable. One does not take oaths on a pivot stone buried underground, as his first suggestion would indicate. So I'm going to continue this contribution on the assumption that dubla means a podium or a platform, or one could even say, given its judicial nature, a tribune. So now let us examine what architectural evidence, insofar as it exists, has to say, to see how this might fit into the administration of justice at Ur and indeed elsewhere. First, though, we need to look at the texts to see if they tell us where a dubla was located. It is not always clear if a dubla mach was inside a temple precinct or at a separate location. Some dubla, or at least one, was certainly associated with a temple. This is clear from Gudæus Cylinder A, in which he tells us he incorporated a dubla, not a dubla mach, but just a dubla, into the Eninu, his new Ningirsu temple. He then compares it to a wild bull and tells us it was provided with Lachama figures. These are the long-haired gate guardians seen on seals. As Lambert showed, Lachmu figures, usually associated with doorways or gates, are also mentioned in the Curse of Akkadi. They are standing at or by a dubla gal, a large dubla, in the Ekur at Nippur. And the same text, the Curse of Akkadi, refers to a dubla at Akkadi itself. So in each of these cases, the dubla seems therefore to have had a doorway flanked by Lachmu figures, who in iconography hold their symbols each side of the doorway. They're not themselves the doorposts. As pointed out by Heimpel, the Lachmu figures could not have been structurally the actual doorposts. In administrative documents and royal inscriptions, the dubla mach is best attested at Ur. Two door sockets with the inscriptions of Shu Ilishu, the lower half of the screen. He is the second king of the dynasty of Isin, which ruled the south after the fall of the Ur III dynasty, indicate that access to the dubla mach was controlled by a door or doors. They must have underpinned the doorposts of the dubla mach. The sockets must have underpinned the doorposts of the dubla mach, and significantly, he calls it his place of judgment. Dubla mach ki dikud ani. Likewise, before him, Amasuen also left us inscribed door sockets. They recorded his restoration of the dubla mach from a dilapidated state. He describes it as the dubla mach, the house, lookout point of the land, his place of judgment. I will need to comment on my translation of that. It's not the same as other people's. He also calls it, rather more ominously, his net from which no enemies of Amarsin can escape. Now, although this text does use the word house, etu in Sumerian, to refer to the dubla mach, it's important to notice that unlike temples and parts of temples or other buildings, the dubla mach never has etu, house, prefixed to it. It's not part of its name. It's only under the Kassite dynasty that the dubla mach does have etu, house, inserted in front of it. Before then, etu does not form part of dubla mach's name, either in royal inscriptions or in judicial texts. So, to sum up for the time being, we should expect a dubla to be a high platform, access to which was controlled by a doorway, sometimes flanked by lachmu figures, and it's a place of judgment. Now, I'd like to turn to the evidence from Woolley's excavations. The Amasuen and Shu Ilishu door sockets found by Woolley at Ur make it certain there was a structure called the dubla mach at the southeast corner of the Temenos enclosure. In an area I've put a yellow square round. That's the Temenos enclosure, the Ekishnugal, the temple of Nana. Here, a Kassite building was excavated by Woolley and identified on the basis of some brick inscriptions of Kurigalzu as the E dubla mach. More on that in a minute. Below the Kassite building, there was an Isin Lhasa predecessor built along the same lines, and there was also some scanty evidence of an Ur III version of the same. And of this, Woolley notes, the back wall of the shrine is of the Isin age, but this was not present in the Ur III plan, and it becomes certain that the Double al-Mach was, in the time of Amarsuén, the main entrance of the ziggurat enclosure. This, however, needs correcting. It is certain, as he says here, that the building was a gatehouse, but it was not the Double al-Mach. As Lambert has pointed out, Woolley's assumption that the Double al-Mach and the gateway are one and the same cannot be correct. It is true that some Kurigalzu bricks do record his work on the Double al-Mach, and it's described in the bricks as the old house which had been built long ago and had become old. But those bricks were found by the southwest door of the Double al-Mach, and by that Woolley refers to the gatehouse. But other Kassite bricks found further to the east, in the area described by Woolley as the Double al-Mach, actually mention restoration work on the old Great Gate, Katu Gal Mach Libira, which had long ago been abandoned. These confirm his statement that the building was the main entrance of the ziggurat enclosure, but they make no mention of the Double al-Mach. So we have to conclude that in Kassite times, the building referred to by Woolley as the Double al-Mach was in fact the old gatehouse and was quite distinct from the real Double al-Mach, which was to its southwest. So the earlier versions of the gatehouse were not the Double al-Mach, and there is no reason to think the Double al-Mach was ever a gateway. Now, in the light of that, we need to look further west in the courtyard southwest of the gateway. When describing what he calls the central space south of the Temenos enclosure in the Kassite period, that's the open paved area south of the Temenos wall, Woolley describes a structure of another sort. And his words here against the decorated Kisu wall, we found a mass of brick rubble packing, which appears to be the core of an altar or platform, approached on the northeast by a ramp or flight of steps. Then, approximately in the same area, but earlier, writing of the Ur III discoveries, he tells us, close to the south corner of the shrine, there was a large rectangular base or altar built of baked bricks set in bitumen, the work of Ur-Nammu. And then in the actual Ur III volume, he says, in the Double al-Mach courtyard, under the south corner of the late podium, there was a large brick base of Ur-Nammu, which so far as shape and size go, would have served admirably as a base for a stela. Unfortunately, I cannot find any precise dimensions of this Ur-Nammu base, nor indeed can I find the dimensions of the presumably Kassite altar or platform with its ramp or steps. To judge from the published plans, the Ur-Nammu platform may have been roughly 6 by 4 meters, but that's a very small plan, so that's a very rough estimate. No published details of the precise dimensions or indeed of the precise location of the Kassite platform. That's from the Kassite plan, and in the middle of the yellow square, you can see this presumably baked brick thing, and as he says earlier on, below the Kisu wall on the bottom right-hand corner. But that is all we have. This feature seems to me to be the same as the Ur III base, which was oriented in the same direction, the same northwest southeast direction as this one here. But it doesn't show the ramp or the flight of steps that Woolley mentioned. There's a question about the Dubla and its proximity to gates. The texts make it certain that the Dubla was neither a temple nor itself a gate, and that judicial procedures belonged with the Dubla Mach rather than with the temple or a gate. But here at Ur, it is clear that it was close to a temple gateway. Judicial proceedings were a secular affair, except for the final oath-taking, for which the participants were usually sent to a temple. So a location just outside the temple makes good sense. And returning to the nature of the Dubla itself, it is usually followed by Mach, high or exalted, suggesting it was raised above the level of the courtyard, and there is some more evidence in the text to support this idea. This is mainly thanks to the name Shu Galam, at Nippur, in a text I haven't quoted, Ishme Dagan of Isin refers to a gate in front of Shu Galam, the place for deciding fates. And already in this Godea quotation, one of 4 occasions on which he mentions Shu Galam in cylinder A, he calls it the awesome place, the place of passing judgment, the place where Ningirsu surveys the lands. That's Dietz Edzard translation. So, just as the Shu Galam at Nippur was a place for deciding fates, so at Girsu it was a place for passing judgment, which sounds suspiciously similar to the Dubla Mach. Although philologically the significance of the initial Shu in Shu Galam is not clear, the Sumerian word Galam is familiar. In an architectural context, the word is best known in the name of the Enlil Zikkurat at Nippur, Hursang Galam Ma. With Piotr Steinkeller, I entirely agree that, quote, the best explanation of this name was provided by Jakobson, who described Hursang Galama as the stairway leading to Ekur's upper temple. And this is fully in agreement with the meaning ladder for Galam, with the wood determinative, and equated with similtu in the lexical tradition. Similtu is the Akkadian for a stairway. Just as a footnote, I know that Pascal Attinger wouldn't agree with this definition of Galam, but others do. The Shu Galam and the Dubla Mach are both described as a place of passing judgment, and both are elevated structures, so it seems possible, perhaps even probable, that Shu Galam is actually a name or an alternative technical designation of a Dubla platform and not a separate installation. Now, at Girsu, Shu Galam was a place from which Ningirsu, and so perhaps also his human subjects, surveyed the land. And this is surely echoed in the inscriptions of Amar Swen, going back to his door socket, where he wrote, the Dubla Mach, the house, lookout point of the land, his place of judgment. And he must, I think, U6D is sometimes translated wonder of the land, but I think that's a fairly vague idea. And the verb U6E or D means just to look. And I suspect what it means more prosaically is the Dubla Mach, the point from which one looks out on the land, referring to those on the platform, whether divine or human, surveying the outside world and its iniquities. In the same way, the ziggurats in Sumerian are called U6 near, which just means very high outlook. So, to wind up, the Dublamach was an elevated platform used for judicial procedures, sometimes including the taking of oaths. It wasn't a gateway or a door socket, although it might be close to a gateway, both at Ur and at Nippur. Nor did its designation include the word to a house. Access to it was clearly controlled by doors, and there is textual evidence suggesting that it was high because it incorporated a staircase or other means of ascent, like the Kassite period ramp reported by Woolley. Now, if I'm right that the platform or platforms shown at that differing orientation on Woolley's plans just southwest of the enclosure wall of the gateway, that represents the Dublamach, it was not originally very large. I suggest it was a raised tribunal where justice was meted out in public, close to the temple gateway, but outside the temple premises. When describing the Ur-3 platform, Woolley wrote, it would have served admirably as a base for a stela. Perhaps he had in mind the great Ur-Nammu stele, the fragments of which were actually found scattered around widely in just this area. By analogy with the stele of Hammurapi, the god here, and I'm not clear whether it's Utu, Shamash, which would be by preference, or Nana, the city god, is entrusting to him the measuring rod and the rope, these symbols of justice. So in English, we have a familiar phrase, justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done. And this springs to mind. I was surprised to find that it was only first formulated 99 years ago in 1923 by a justice called Lord Hewitt, just as Woolley was taking to the field at Ur. But the principle that to ensure social acceptance, justice should be carried out in full view of the people and, of course, of the sun, Utu, the god of justice, that principle must be much older. And thank you all.
Nicholas, thank you very much. That was, I'm sorry not to be able to see you, to thank you for that really illuminating talk, transforming a plan of a site we're all familiar with and so used to seeing the Dublamach. Now we have a completely different vision of what it is, what it might be. Are there any questions for Professor Postgate? Yeah. Can you see that, Nicholas, I hope?
Well, obviously the Dublamach must represent the concept of justice, I think. So conceivably, this is just a general statement, or maybe there's some event in the past history of the family which gave this name, where they were grateful to the High Court of Justice for something which had been decided there.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Professor Salaboga.
Yes, I noticed the days of Anne, and I got the impression that the days of Anne was perhaps a larger space, maybe not so close to the gateway, but further to the west and possibly even in the denuded area which you mentioned, just south of the platform shown on the plan. But it's so frustrating that we don't have. Maybe they are in the British Museum or somewhere. We don't have the detailed plans of these two daises to see more of how they relate to each other.
Thank you. And then we have a question which takes us beyond Mesopotamia. Stuart Wheatman.
I'm afraid I don't extend beyond Mesopotamia, so that I would need to know more about how the Bama was actually used. Am I right in thinking that Bama etymologically means a high place?
So that's
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah. Well, the same principle might well apply, but it would be hard to be sure.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions? No. Well, thank you once again for a terrific paper, and I hope the next time we'll be able to see you in person. But
I'm sorry.
very, very great.